The carriage jolted as it crossed another mud puddle in the streets of New York, and Isabelle Dubois clutched to her chest the only suitcase remaining from her previous life. Inside it, between patched dresses and worn books, lay the last portrait of her mother, painted when the Dubois were still received in the most illustrious Parisian salons. Now, in 1847, that name meant nothing but ashes and debts. The coachman announced their arrival with a grunt, and Isabelle descended alone, refusing to show hesitation before the mansion that loomed impressively on Fifth Avenue. The Crawford residence had 3 stories of dark stone, with tall windows that reflected the leaden October sky. Nothing comparable to the palaces she had known in her youth, but still intimidating in its American solidity, so different from the decaying elegance of European estates. A severe-looking housekeeper answered the door before Isabelle could even reach the bronze knocker. "Mademoiselle Dubois, I presume." The woman examined her from head to toe with perceptive eyes. "I am Mrs. Harriet Walsh. Mr. Crawford does not receive visitors, but the children await you in the study." Isabelle lifted her chin, a gesture her mother always said was her trademark. "Thank you for the reception, Madame Walsh. I hope to live up to the family's expectations." "We shall see." The housekeeper led her through an entrance hall decorated with masculine austerity. Dark wood, somber landscape paintings, no feminine touch in sight. "The children are challenging. We've had 4 governesses in the past 8 months." The corridor seemed endless, and Isabelle noticed closed doors, heavy curtains, an atmosphere of permanent mourning. Her mind, trained since childhood to observe social nuances, perceived the absence of fresh flowers, of laughter, of any sign of genuine family life. "Mr. Crawford lost his wife 2 years ago," Mrs. Walsh continued as if reading her thoughts. "Since then, he devotes himself solely to business. He sees the children only at dinner when he is home, which is not frequent." Isabelle knew the weight of grief well. Her own father had withered after the financial ruin that forced them to flee France, pursued by merciless creditors. He had died 3 months before they reached America, leaving her alone in a world that did not forgive women without fortune or protection. The study proved surprisingly bright, with large windows facing an inner garden. 2 pairs of eyes examined her with poorly disguised suspicion. The girl, whom Isabelle estimated to be about 9 years old, sat upright like a little queen, her impeccable green velvet dress, her brown hair held in elaborate braids. The boy, a few years younger, swung his legs under the chair, his knees already stained with grass. "I am Isabelle Dubois, your new French and manners governess." She did not wait for permission to sit, choosing a chair that placed her at the children's eye level. "And you are?" "I am Margaret Crawford," the girl declared with excessive formality. "This is my brother, William. You won't stay long like the others." "Why not?" Isabelle tilted her head, genuinely curious. "Because we are impossible to teach," William replied with poorly suppressed pride. The last lady cried. What a pity for her. Isabelle opened her suitcase and retrieved a book bound in red leather. "I presume you know how to read English. Can you understand this?" She opened it to a random page, revealing verses in French. Margaret approached, curiosity overcoming caution. "Is it poetry?" "By Madame de Staël, a remarkable woman who challenged emperors with her words." Isabelle observed the growing interest in the girl's eyes. She proved that female intelligence knows no boundaries imposed by men. "Father says women should be ornamental and obedient," Margaret murmured, but there was questioning in her voice. "Your father is a successful businessman, certainly." Isabelle chose her words carefully, but even the wisest men can have limited opinions on certain subjects. A noise at the door made all 3 turn simultaneously. A man filled the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a black frock coat that accentuated the pallor of his face. Benjamin Crawford possessed features marked by severe angles as if carved from granite, and stormy grey eyes that seemed to carry the weight of oceans. "Mademoiselle Dubois." His voice was grave, controlled. "I did not expect to find you discussing the limits of masculine wisdom on your first day." Isabelle rose, but did not lower her gaze. "Monsieur Crawford, I was simply sharing literature with your children. I believe that education should expand horizons, not reinforce prisons." Something flickered in those grey eyes, too fast to be identified. Surprise, anger, reluctant respect. My previous governesses limited themselves to teaching basic vocabulary and table etiquette. Then you hired governesses, not tutors. Isabel maintained a respectful but firm tone. I read your correspondence. You requested someone capable of preparing your children for international societies. That requires more than memorizing verbs. Benjamin Crawford entered the room, and Isabel noticed how the children immediately stiffened, all spontaneity vanishing. He was a dominating presence, not by height or posture, but by something deeper, a contained grief that filled the space around him like a chilling mist. "Margaret, William, leave us." His order was soft, but unequivocal. The children left quickly, and Isabel found herself alone with the man who, for the next weeks or months, would be her employer. She had learned to read faces in the Parisian salons, where every expression could mean alliance or betrayal. Benjamin Crawford was an enigma of contradictions, impeccable clothes over tense shoulders, hands that seemed to want to break something, eyes that looked without truly seeing. "You are very different from the other candidates." He walked to the window, maintaining a deliberate distance. "Younger, more direct. Adversity has a way of burning off unnecessary pretensions, monsieur." Isabel clasped her hands, remembering her mother's lessons in deportment. Always appear confident, even when the world crumbles. "I lost everything except my education. I cannot afford false modesty." "Why did you leave France?" "A family financial collapse." She saw no reason to lie. "My father invested poorly, trusted the wrong people. When he died, I discovered that even our estate was mortgaged. I came to America because here, they say, the past matters less than the present." Benjamin turned, and for the first time his eyes truly focused on her. "And what did you find?" "A young country, brutal in its honesty, but with possibilities that Europe had long forgotten." Isabel allowed herself a small smile, and an opportunity to rebuild something new upon old ruins. Silence filled the room. From the garden came distant sounds of birds, and Isabel could hear Benjamin's controlled breathing, as if he constantly strove to keep something locked within himself. "My wife died giving birth to our third child." The words came out abruptly, without preparation. "The baby did not survive either. Since then, this house has become a mausoleum where living people pretend to exist." The frankness surprised Isabel more than the tragedy itself. "And you wish me to teach French and manners to children living in a tomb?" "I wish someone to show them that there is still life beyond these walls." Benjamin clenched his fists. "That not everything is dead." Isabel understood then. This was not simply a tutoring job. It was a rescue, perhaps, of all of them. "Then you will have to give me freedom, Monsieur Crawford. I cannot teach life while a prisoner of dead protocols." "Do what you deem necessary." He moved towards the door but paused on the threshold. "Just don't give up on them as the others did. They have lost much. They don't need to lose hope as well." When she was alone again, Isabel approached the window Benjamin had just left. The garden below was wild, needing care, but beneath the neglect she could see bones of ancient beauty. Like this family, she thought, like herself. The challenge before her was immense, and for the first time since she had set foot on American soil, Isabelle Dubois felt something beyond fear and despair. She felt purpose. The first week in the Crawford mansion proved a study in contrasts. During the day, the house breathed with the contained energy of the children and the usual household noises. At nightfall, it transformed into a silent cathedral where footsteps echoed like confessed sins. Isabel had established a routine that defied conventional expectations. Instead of confining lessons to the study, she led Margaret and William through the different rooms, transforming each space into a living classroom. In the library, she taught vocabulary through leather-bound volumes. In the neglected garden, they practiced conversation while identifying plants in Latin and French. Margaret proved a voracious student, absorbing knowledge with a hunger that went beyond simple obedience. During a rainy afternoon, when Isabel was reciting Molière, the girl interrupted with an unexpected question. "Mademoiselle, did my mother speak French?" Isabel paused, choosing her words carefully. I don't know, Sherry. Your father never mentioned it. He never mentions anything about her. Margaret's voice carried carefully cultivated resentment. It's as if she never existed. All the portraits were removed, her belongings donated. Only her piano remained in the music room, covered by a white sheet like a ghost. William, usually more reserved than his sister, added, I remember her perfume. Jasmine and something sweet, like honey. Sometimes I wake up thinking I smell her, but it's only a dream. That conversation haunted Isabel for the following days. She understood Benjamin's impulse to erase painful memories, but the children needed memories, not a vacuum. She decided to address the matter, awaiting an appropriate opportunity. This presented itself on a Thursday, when Benjamin returned unexpectedly early from his offices. Isabel was in the hallway, rearranging wildflowers she had gathered with the children. Floral arrangements were not among her duties, but the house yearned for life, and Mrs. Walsh had not objected. Mademoiselle Dubois. His voice emerged from the shadows of the corridor, making her startle. You've transformed my residence into a botanical garden. Isabel turned, meeting those grey eyes that seemed perpetually haunted. He was in work attire, his tie slightly loosened, the first imperfection she had noticed in his usual presentation. The children gathered these flowers during a lesson on botany. Margaret has a natural talent for arrangements. Isabel did not apologize, maintaining a professional tone. I considered it educational to allow them to exercise creativity. Benjamin approached, examining the flowers with an indecipherable expression. My wife used to do this. She filled every room with wildflowers, said they brought the outside in. His hand extended, touching delicate petals with unconscious tenderness. Jasmine was her favorite. Isabel recognized the fragile moment, the first crack in the armor he kept so carefully erected. William mentions he still remembers her perfume. Benjamin's fingers froze. He shouldn't. He was too young. The heart's memory ignores the logic of age. Isabel ventured a step closer. Monsieur Crawford, may I speak frankly? I presume you will, regardless of my permission. There was a trace of something that might be humor in his voice, bitter as ashes. Your children need to remember their mother, not as a ghostly presence that haunts silences, but as a real person who loved them. Isabel watched resistance harden his features. Erasing all evidence of her existence does not eliminate the pain. It merely transforms love into an infected wound that never heals properly. Benjamin stepped back abruptly, his shoulders tense beneath his dark coat. You presume to know my grief. I know my own. Isabel did not retreat. When my father died, I wished to burn everything that reminded me of him, every letter, every portrait, every object that carried his essence. It seemed that only then could I breathe again without feeling glass shattering in my lungs. He turned slowly, and Isabel saw genuine surprise on his face. And what stopped you? I discovered I wasn't erasing the pain. I was erasing the person I had been before it. My father was flawed, his mistakes cost us everything, but he was also a man who taught me to read, who recited poetry before bed, who believed that women possessed minds as sharp as men's. Isabel allowed emotion to show in her voice. If I erased him completely, I would also erase those parts of myself. The silence stretched between them like an unstable bridge. Benjamin remained motionless, but Isabel perceived a battle waging behind those stormy eyes. Finally he spoke, his voice hoarse. Catherine died in my arms. I held her as life drained away, unable to do anything but watch. His hands clenched into fists. I had promised to protect her, to provide for her, and I failed in the only thing that truly mattered. Every object in this house, every memory is an accusation of my inadequacy. Isabel felt tears stinging her eyes, but she held them back. This was not her moment to cry. And now, do you still believe that beauty should be punished for the existence of tragedy? Benjamin turned, and the desolation on his face cut her more deeply than any accusation. I don't know what I believe. I only know that entering this room, seeing that piano uncovered, hearing notes that Catherine used to play, it was like losing her again. No, Isabel approached, boldness born of compassion overcoming social caution. It was like finding her again. The difference is subtle but absolute. Your daughter felt a connection with her mother for the first time in 2 years. That is not a betrayal of Catherine's memory. It is an honor. You speak with the certainty of one who has never loved and lost in this way. There was accusation in his words, but also genuine curiosity. I speak with the certainty of one who still loves those who have departed. Isabel allowed emotion to tint her voice. My father died believing himself a failure, his last days poisoned by shame for leaving us in destitution. For months after his death, I avoided everything that reminded me of him, because the guilt was unbearable. Guilt for not having prevented his disastrous decisions, for not having been enough to keep him living. Benjamin watched her with renewed intensity, his armor temporarily abandoned. But then I realized something fundamental, Isabel continued, words flowing with naked truth. By avoiding his memories, I was not only abandoning him again, I was abandoning parts of myself that he had helped create. The stories he told, the lessons he taught, the love he offered before things fell apart, all of that was real. As real as the mistakes that destroyed our family. And that makes the pain more tolerable? The question emerged without sarcasm, genuine vulnerability. No, it makes it meaningful. Isabel risked a bold move, her hand lightly touching his arm. Pain without purpose is merely suffering, but pain that connects us to those we love, that preserves the best of them in us and in our children, that pain possesses dignity. Benjamin looked down at her hand on his arm but did not remove it. You are dangerously eloquent, Mademoiselle Dubois. I am desperately honest. Monsieur Crawford. She removed her hand, respecting proprietary boundaries. And I see a family destroying itself for fear of feeling. That is a waste that Catherine would surely lament. He remained motionless for a long moment, internal battles waging behind those stormy eyes. Then, surprising her completely, he walked to the piano and touched a single key. The note sounded clear, filling the space with perfect simplicity. She would play here every evening when I returned from business, he murmured, his fingers tracing patterns over the keyboard without pressing the keys. She said music tamed the beast that the commercial world awakened in me. She was wise. Isabel approached from the other side of the instrument, and she would have wished her children to know that part of her. Benjamin looked up, and something fundamental altered between them. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, nor even agreement, but it was recognition, perhaps of spirits equally marked by losses that refused to bend completely. The music lessons will continue, he said finally, his voice regaining firmness. But only 3 times weekly, and with my prior approval on repertoire. It was a compromise, a partial victory that Isabel accepted with grace. An agreeable solution. Margaret possesses a talent that deserves proper cultivation. And William? A note of something that might be humor touched his voice. I noticed you didn't mention the boy. William possesses a natural gift that transcends formal instruction. Should he remain interested, he should have a specialized instructor. Isabel allowed herself a small smile. But that is a discussion for a future moment, when you are not contemplating dismissing me. Benjamin did not smile, but his shoulders relaxed slightly. If I were going to dismiss you, I would have done so weeks ago. You are inconveniently indispensable, it seems. The words carried a weight that went beyond their superficial meaning, and Isabel felt heat rise up her neck. She quickly turned to gather sheet music, needing a moment to regain emotional equilibrium. When she left the room minutes later, aware of Benjamin remaining alone with memories finally confronted, Isabel understood that something irrevocable had occurred, not just between employer and employee, but between 2 souls recognizing each other in the scars they carried. The days following the reopening of the music room brought subtle but noticeable changes to the Crawford mansion, like ice gradually yielding to the hesitant arrival of spring. Benjamin did not mention the incident again, but Isabel noticed his occasional presence nearby during the music lessons, a silent shadow in the hallway that never crossed the threshold of the door. The relationship between them had become curiously delicate, a dance of approach and retreat, where each small advance was immediately balanced by cautious distance. During formal dinners, where Isabel occasionally joined the family, as was the custom of the house, Benjamin addressed courteous questions about the children's progress, but avoided any topic that might rekindle the involuntary intimacy they had shared that afternoon. Isabel understood the defense mechanism, She herself was disturbingly aware of his presence, as if the air thickened when he entered a room. This was dangerous territory for a governess without fortune or protection, and she could not afford the luxury of inappropriate feelings for an employer, no matter how complex and intriguing he might be. December arrived with the first snowfall, transforming New York into a landscape that awakened bittersweet memories of Parisian winters in Isabel. Margaret and William incessantly pressed her to allow them to play in the snow-covered garden, and she finally relented, considering that French lessons could perfectly well take place outdoors. That was how Benjamin found them, one frosty Saturday morning, when he had returned unexpectedly early from an office engagement. Isabel was teaching winter vocabulary by building a snowman, Margaret reciting French terms, while William enthusiastically molded snowballs with a zeal he rarely displayed indoors. "Mademoiselle Dubois," his voice reached her through the crisp air, "do you not fear the children will fall ill with such exposure?" Isabel turned, finding him standing at the glass door leading to the garden, still dressed in his overcoat and top hat, as if he had interrupted an important meeting. "Children need fresh air and movement, monsieur. They are not fragile ornaments that break with a little dampness." Margaret approached her father, cheeks flushed from the cold and exercise. "We're learning about winter in 3 languages. Mademoiselle says true education involves the body as much as the mind." Something flickered across Benjamin's face, an expression so fleeting that Isabel couldn't decipher it. "And does this justify turning my garden into a snow battlefield?" "Battlefield?" William emerged from behind the partially built snowman, his eyes gleaming with childish mischief. "We haven't started the battle yet, Papa. Do you want to join?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch infinitely. Isabel watched Benjamin process the unexpected invitation, saw the internal struggle between adult decorum and something more primal, perhaps a memory of when he himself was a child who found joy in simple things. "It wouldn't be appropriate," he began, but William was already molding a snowball, a conspiratorial smile lighting up his usually serious face. "But you used to do this with us," the boy protested, before Mama left. "I remember one time you threw snow at Mrs. Walsh and she screamed for 5 whole minutes. Margaret laughed, a sound so rare and precious that Isabel felt a pang in her chest. "And Mama made a snow angel, but you pulled her and both of you fell and lay there laughing until you were soaked." The transformation on Benjamin's face was like watching a storm approach. Pain, longing, and something more desperate that Isabel recognized as a man struggling between burying himself deeper in grief or allowing himself a small moment of life. "That was a long time ago," he finally said, his voice controlled with visible effort. 3 years isn't an eternity, Papa." Margaret approached, her small hand finding his. "Mademoiselle says happy memories don't betray the dead. They honor them by reminding us that their lives meant joy, not just sadness." Benjamin shot Isabel a sharp look, and she realized she had crossed an invisible line again, but instead of the anger she expected, she saw something different in his stormy eyes. Surrender, perhaps, or the exhaustion of maintaining walls that demanded increasingly scarce energy. "Very well." He removed his top hat, placing it carefully on the windowsill. "But let us establish civilized rules for this battle. No headshots and certainly no attacks on the French governess, who will no doubt judge us all American barbarians." William let out a shout of joy, and Margaret clapped, genuine happiness illuminating her usually restrained features. Isabel stepped back a few paces, intending to observe from a safe distance, but Benjamin pointed at her. "No neutrality, mademoiselle. Choose your side." "This is a conspiracy to ruin my decent dress," she protested, but couldn't suppress the smile that curved her lips. "Very well. I ally myself with the children. Mr. Crawford against the 3 of us seems fair." "Fair?" He raised an eyebrow, beginning to remove his overcoat. 3 against 1 is the definition of a strategic disadvantage." "Then consider this a lesson in humility," Isabel retorted, already molding ammunition with William's enthusiastic help. What followed was a complete abandonment of adult decorum. Benjamin demonstrated surprisingly accurate aim, but was clearly out of practice and hampered by his formal attire. The children attacked with disorganized energy, laughing so much that they often missed easy targets. Isabel found herself laughing too, a sound that had seemed impossible during months of struggling for survival. At one point, Benjamin managed a tactical maneuver that brought him dangerously close, and Isabel found herself face to face with him, both breathless from the exertion. Snow clung to his dark hair, and there was a flush on his pale cheeks that made him look years younger. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an electric current that had nothing to do with cold or exercise. "Surrender, mademoiselle?" His voice emerged lower, almost intimate despite the children's presence a few yards away. "The French never surrender, monsieur." Isabel lifted her chin, but her heart was beating in a way that had nothing to do with a snow battle. "We merely retreat strategically, then prepare for a strategic defeat." But instead of attacking, he remained still, his gaze fixed on her face, with an intensity that made the air between them suddenly seem scarce. Margaret interrupted the moment by throwing snow at both of them, shouting about an unfair alliance between adults. The tension broke and Benjamin moved away, but Isabel felt the ghost of his proximity for a long time afterward. When they finally retreated indoors, soaked and chilled, Mrs. Walsh met them in the vestibule and let out a scandalized exclamation. "Mr. Crawford, you look like a vagrant, and the children, heavens above, they'll fall ill." But there was a note of affection in her reprimand, and Isabel realized that the housekeeper also felt relief in witnessing a moment of genuine normalcy in that house haunted by ghosts. That night, after the children were put to bed, Isabel found herself in the library, enjoying the privilege Benjamin had granted her to use the collection during her free hours. She was absorbed in a volume of Byron's poetry when a rustle of footsteps alerted her to a presence. She looked up to find Benjamin standing at the entrance, still dressed in his dinner clothes. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. "I didn't expect to find anyone here." "The library is yours," Isabel replied, beginning to close the book. "I shall withdraw." "No." The word emerged more abruptly than he apparently intended. "Stay. This house is too large for just one person to wander alone at night." Isabel hesitated but nodded, settling back into the armchair. Benjamin moved to the bar, pouring brandy into 2 crystal glasses. He extended one to her without asking, a gesture that completely violated employer-employee protocol, but which both seemed willing to ignore in that moment. "Thank you for today," he finally said, settling into the opposite armchair. "The children. I haven't seen them so happy since before Catherine's death." "They need you," Isabel replied softly, "not just as a provider or a distant authority, but as a father who participates in their lives. I fear that participation will only expose them to more loss." He twirled the glass between his fingers, watching the amber liquid catch the firelight. "If I allow myself to love them completely, if I lower the guard that keeps pain manageable, I don't know if I will survive another loss." "Then you have already lost them." Isabel's words emerged gentle but firm. "Because they will grow. They will become adults. They will follow their own paths. That is inevitable. The only question is whether, when they leave, they will have memories of a father who loved them fully, or of a distant shadow who existed in the same spaces, but never truly with them." Benjamin looked up, and the vulnerability in his eyes cut Isabel more deeply than any accusation. "How did you become so wise at such a young age?" "I lost everything except the ability to observe honestly." She took a small sip, the warmth of the brandy spreading through her chest. "When one has nothing left to lose, clarity becomes a luxury one can finally afford." "And what do you see when you observe me?" The question carried genuine curiosity mingled with something more dangerous. Isabel carefully considered her words. "I see a man who believes love is weakness, because the only time he loved completely, he lost everything. So he built a fortress around what remains of his heart, not realizing that fortresses are also prisons." A brutal analysis, but there was no anger in his voice, only tired recognition. "And your solution?" "I have no solutions, Monsieur Crawford." Isabel allowed a small, sad smile. "Only the observation that survival without life is a slow death, and you have been dying for 2 years, taking your children with you." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling of the flames. Isabel wondered if she had gone too far, if she would finally see anger explode through the control he maintained so carefully. But when Benjamin spoke again, his voice carried only deep exhaustion. "Catherine would say exactly this. She never accepted my excuses or allowed me to hide behind convenient logic." He paused, his gaze lost in the flames. "Her absence is a black hole that consumes everything around it. I don't know how to stop it." "It begins by allowing light in," Isabel suggested softly. "Small moments like today, shared memories with the children, music in the room that has remained silent for too long. Every small act of life is resistance against the darkness." Benjamin watched her for a long moment, and Isabel felt the weight of his scrutiny as a physical presence. "You are an extraordinary person, Isabelle Dubois, and I fear that your presence in this house is making it impossible to maintain the illusions that have protected me until now." The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning that neither dared to fully articulate. Isabel knew she should withdraw, re-establish the appropriate distance between governess and employer. But she remained, held by his gaze, by the moment of connection that transcended social roles. "Perhaps," she finally said, "illusions are not protection. Perhaps they are merely another form of death." Benjamin did not reply, but something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere between them. When Isabel finally retired to her quarters hours later, she knew they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no complete return. Christmas approached with its inevitable demand for celebrations, and the Crawford mansion faced the prospect of festivities with the same reluctance as prisoners anticipating execution. For the first time in 2 years, however, there was hesitant movement towards some observance of the date, driven primarily by Isabel's quiet insistence and the children's increasingly bold pleas. Margaret casually mentioned during a French lesson that they used to decorate the house with pine boughs and holly, that there was a traditional tree in the main hall, and that their mother organized a small dinner for staff and their families on Christmas Eve. William added, with transparent nostalgia in his young voice, that their father always read the story of Christ's birth before they went to sleep, imitating different voices that made them laugh until their ribs ached. Isabel had absorbed these fragments of lost happiness and made a decision she knew was risky. During one of the rare occasions when she found Benjamin in the library, she approached the subject with a diplomacy that would have made any Parisian ambassador proud. "Monsieur Crawford, I wish to discuss the Christmas celebrations." He looked up from the business documents he was examining, his expression immediately closing off. "There will be no celebrations. There never have been since Catherine left." "I understand your pain." Isabel maintained a respectful but determined tone. "However, the children need traditions. They need to believe that life continues, that joy did not permanently die with their mother." "You don't understand what you're talking about." His voice had become dangerously low, a warning Isabel had already learned to recognize. "That was the last time we celebrated as a complete family. Catherine was alive, pregnant, radiant with anticipation of the new baby. 6 weeks later, both were dead. Tell me, mademoiselle, how can I celebrate a date that directly precedes the greatest tragedy of my life?" Isabel then understood the full dimension of his resistance. It wasn't merely abstract grief, but a specific association between that last happy celebration and the catastrophe that followed, as if Christmas had been a cruel prelude to the destruction to come. "Then create a new memory," she said softly. "You don't replace the old one, but add a different layer. The children deserve future Christmases that are not eternally stained by past tragedy." He remained silent for so long that Isabel thought she had completely lost this battle. But then, with an exhaustion that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within his soul, Benjamin partially relented. A small observance, just the family, no elaborate dinner, no festivity that demands. Falseness. Isabel accepted the limited victory and dedicated herself to creating a modest but meaningful celebration. With the help of Mrs. Walsh, who had revealed surprising enthusiasm for the project, she organized discreet decorations for the main hall. Margaret and William were recruited to help, and the preparation activity became almost as valuable as the event itself. On Christmas Eve morning, Isabel had woken early, disturbed by a dream where her father appeared young and healthy, smiling as he taught her to waltz in the ballroom of her lost Parisian estate. The melancholy that accompanied such dreams usually pursued her for hours, but that day there were tasks that demanded her attention, leaving little room for indulgence in personal sorrow. She found Benjamin in the vestibule as she descended for breakfast, and the expression on his face revealed that he too had been haunted by memories during the night. There were shadows under his eyes, and his collar was slightly askew, an imperfection so rare that it immediately alerted Isabel to his emotional state. "Good morning, monsieur." She hesitated, uncertain if she should mention his disheveled appearance. "Did you sleep well?" "I would lie if I said yes." He adjusted his collar with a brusque movement, as if only then noticing the irregularity. This date always brings particularly persistent ghosts. Isabel descended the last steps, approaching closer than protocol would normally allow. "Can I help in any way, even if it's just listening?" Benjamin studied her with that intensity that always made her feel simultaneously exposed and understood. "You are strangely persistent in your determination to save this family, Mademoiselle Dubois." "I do not seek to save anyone," she gently corrected, "only to offer companionship in the process of you saving yourselves." Something trembled in the depths of those grey eyes, an emotion too quick to be named but powerful enough to alter the air between them. Benjamin took a step towards her, so close now that Isabel could feel the heat emanating from his body, could count each eyelash if she dared to fully lift her gaze. "And who saves you, Isabel?" The use of her given name without the formal title sent a shiver down her spine. "Who offers companionship in your own process of salvation?" The question penetrated defenses Isabel hadn't even realized she was maintaining. I don't need." "You lie poorly." His hand lifted, fingers lightly touching her face, tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that completely contrasted with the usual harshness of his manners. "You carry your own pain like armor, pretending it has already healed when it still bleeds in secret." Isabel should have pulled away. Every rule of propriety, every principle of self-preservation demanded that she establish immediate distance, but she remained motionless, held by his touch, for the first time in months feeling seen not as an efficient tutor or a needy refugee, but simply as a woman with her own wounds. "Benjamin." His name emerged as a whisper, and she saw its impact register on his face, his pupils dilating slightly. The moment stretched like glass about to shatter. Then rapid footsteps in the upper corridor announced the children's imminent arrival, and both recoiled simultaneously. Appropriate distance restored with a speed that revealed mutual guilt. Margaret and William descended the stairs in a whirlwind of energy, talking about decorations they planned to complete that morning, completely oblivious to the tension that moments before had saturated the vestibule. Benjamin recomposed himself with impressive speed, his mask of control sliding back into place with ease born of long practice. But when his eyes met Isabel's over the children's heads, she saw recognition there. Something fundamental had altered between them, a line being crossed that could not be uncrossed, no matter how many appropriate distances they superficially restored. The day unfolded in frantic activity. Margaret had revealed a surprising talent for decorative arrangements, creating holly garlands intertwined with red ribbons that Mrs. Walsh had produced from a dusty trunk in the attic. William, with the typical enthusiasm of a 6-year-old boy, had insisted on helping drag in a small pine tree that the gardener had cut specifically for the occasion. Benjamin observed from a distance, present but not participating, a ghost in his own house. Isabel noticed how his clenched hands revealed the effort required to remain in the memory-laden environment he had spent 2 years actively avoiding. In the middle of the afternoon, when the children retired for a rest supervised by Mrs. Walsh, Isabel found herself alone again with Benjamin in the now decorated hall. He remained by the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the flames as if searching for answers in the dancing fire patterns. "Is it too much?" she asked softly, approaching but maintaining a respectful distance. "I can remove some decorations if they become unbearable." "No." His voice emerged hoarse. "It's appropriate. Catherine would approve, I believe. She always believed that beauty was an obligation, not a luxury. She used to say that the world contained enough pain without us adding unnecessary ugliness." Isabel absorbed this revelation about the late Mrs. Crawford, adding it to the mental portrait she had been constructing through fragments shared by the children and Benjamin's occasional involuntary confidences. She seems to have been a remarkable woman. She was. Benjamin finally turned, and the vulnerability on his face cut Isabel deeply. "And my inability to save her remains a wound that will never heal properly. You could not save her." The words emerged firm, without concession to his self-pity. Death in childbirth is a tragedy as old as humanity. No love, no fortune, no masculine power can prevent it when fate so decides. Rationality does not alleviate guilt. "No," Isabel agreed, "but time can. And a deliberate choice to live despite the loss, not in denial of it, but in recognition that those we loved would wish us to continue." Benjamin approached, and again Isabel found herself caught by the intensity of his presence. "How did you become so certain of truths that completely escape me?" "I am certain of nothing," she admitted. "I merely refuse to accept that survival is all that remains when we lose those we love. There must be more, otherwise what is the purpose of continuing?" He was too close now, violating every social convention. Isabel could see a small scar above his right eyebrow, the result of some old accident. She could count the fine lines radiating from the corners of his eyes, maps of accumulated worries and sorrows. "Isabel." Her name emerged like a prayer or a confession. "I don't know what you are doing to me, but it becomes increasingly impossible to maintain the distance I know to be appropriate." Her heart quickened, fear and longing mixing into a dangerous cocktail. "Benjamin, we cannot. I am your employee, without fortune or position. Anything beyond a professional relationship would be disastrous," he completed, but did not pull away. "Socially unacceptable, potentially destructive to my reputation and certainly to yours. I enumerate the objections frequently, trying to convince myself that they are sufficient." "And are they?" Her whisper was barely audible. "They should be." His hand lifted again, this time caressing her face with a deliberation that left no doubt about his intentions. "But you have penetrated defenses I believed impenetrable. You make me question certainties I held as gospels, and I fear it is already too late to restore the indifference that should exist between us." Isabel knew she should protest, restore propriety through firm refusal, but she leaned involuntarily into his touch, her body betraying the resolution her mind tried to maintain. "This is madness," she murmured. "Complete," Benjamin agreed, leaning closer, his breath mingling with hers. "And yet—" The sound of a door opening separated them with guilty speed. Mrs. Walsh entered, carrying a tea tray, stopping abruptly upon perceiving the scene. Her sharp gaze moved between them, registering the improper proximity, flushed faces, and laden atmosphere. "Forgive the interruption," she said with a dryness that indicated clear disapproval. "I thought you might desire refreshment." Benjamin recomposed himself first, appropriate distance restored with movements that seemed to require physical effort. "Thank you, Mrs. Walsh. Mademoiselle Dubois and I were merely discussing the final arrangements for tomorrow." The housekeeper set down the tray with a precision that suggested contained judgment. "Certainly. I shall call the children when they are rested." She withdrew, but not before casting Isabel a look that clearly communicated a warning. When they were alone again, the spell was broken. Benjamin moved completely away, his hands clasped behind his back, formal posture restored. "This cannot happen," he declared, but there was a regret in his voice that contradicted the firmness of his words. "Your position in this house, your reputation." "I understand." Isabel forced her own firmness, even as her heart protested. "Forgive my impropriety." "There was no impropriety on your part." His eyes met hers briefly. "The transgression was entirely mine, and I assure you, it will not be repeated." It was a sensible, necessary, completely appropriate promise. So why did it sound like a death sentence for something Isabel hadn't even realized she was waiting for? Christmas arrived and passed in quiet observance that would have seemed melancholic had it not been for the genuine joy in the children. Benjamin had kept his promise of appropriate distance, but Isabel noticed occasional glances, moments where his defenses wavered enough to reveal the emotional turbulence he struggled to contain. Something had irreversibly changed between them, and both knew that pretending indifference had become impossible. The question remaining was what they would do with this inconvenient reality. Winter advanced with unusual severity, transforming New York into an icy landscape that imprisoned the city as much as the undeclared feelings imprisoned Isabel and Benjamin. January had arrived with biting winds that moaned through the poorly sealed windows of the Crawford mansion, as if nature itself mourned the tension that saturated every corridor, every chance encounter between the French governess and the tormented widower. Isabel had established a rigorous routine that minimized direct contact with Benjamin, obsessively dedicating herself to lessons with Margaret and William. The children flourished under her tutelage, Margaret developing remarkable proficiency in French, while William demonstrated a musical talent that transcended his young age. But the children's academic progress offered little consolation for the emptiness that grew in Isabel's chest whenever she heard Benjamin's footsteps in the corridor, whenever their hands accidentally touched during dinner, whenever their gazes met across the room, and she saw in them a reflection of her own torment. Benjamin, for his part, had plunged into business with a fervor that Mrs. Walsh described as concerning. He left before dawn, returned after the children were already asleep, systematically avoiding any situation that might result in a private moment with Isabel. During the rare family dinners that his conscience forced him to attend, he kept conversation strictly focused on the children's educational progress, never allowing dialogue to stray to more personal matters. It was an elaborate dance of mutual avoidance, and both knew it was unsustainable. The crisis arrived on a frigid February afternoon, when a snowstorm turned into a blizzard that forced Benjamin to return unexpectedly early. Isabel found herself alone in the library, the children having been taken by Mrs. Walsh for a needlework lesson that the housekeeper had insisted was necessary for Margaret, regardless of Mademoiselle Dubois' modern opinions on female education. The sound of the main door violently opening alerted Isabel to the abrupt arrival. Moments later, Benjamin entered the library, his clothes covered in snow, his face flushed from the cold, and something more intense that the weather did not fully explain. "The storm has worsened," he announced without preamble, removing his soaked overcoat. "Roads are impassable. No one will leave or enter this house for the next few hours, possibly until tomorrow." Isabel closed the book she wasn't really reading, her heart quickening with the awareness that they were effectively trapped together. The children? Safe with Mrs. Walsh in the upper quarters, she planned to keep them occupied with domestic activities. Benjamin moved to the fireplace, extending cold hands towards the warmth, "which leaves us in an inconvenient situation." Inconvenient. Isabel repeated the word, savoring its inadequacy to describe the tension that vibrated between them like a violin string stretched to breaking point. Benjamin turned, and the intensity in his grey eyes made the air suddenly seem scarce. "I can no longer feign indifference, Isabel. This pretense of propriety is destroying me." The words hung between them, confession and accusation simultaneously. Isabel stood, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed them against her simple wool skirt. "And what do you propose? That we completely abandon decorum? That we ignore the realities of our positions?" "I don't know what I propose." He crossed the distance between them with deliberate steps, stopping too close for comfort, close enough that Isabel could see the struggle warring behind his controlled expression. "I only know that each day becomes more unbearable. To see you, not to be able to touch you, to pretend that you are merely an efficient employee when you occupy my thoughts every waking moment and haunt my dreams when I finally fall asleep." Isabel's heart beat so violently that she feared he could hear it. "Benjamin, this is madness. I possess no fortune, my family is ruined, my reputation is already fragile due to my vulnerable position. If anyone were to discover that there is, that something exists between us, I would be completely destroyed. Then I will not permit them to discover it." His hand lifted, fingers tracing the contour of her face with a reverence that made tears sting her eyes. "But neither can I continue living in this pretense of indifference. Catherine is dead, and for 2 years I have treated this fact as a personal betrayal of life. But you have made me understand that honoring her memory does not require me to die also." "I am not asking you to love me," Isabel protested, even as her body leaned involuntarily towards his. "I have no right to such expectations, but I love you." The words emerged with devastating simplicity, devoid of romantic flourishes or elaborate declarations. I fought against this, rationalized, sought all the logical reasons why it is impossible, improper, potentially destructive. And none of them alter the fundamental fact that when I see your face, when I hear your voice, when I witness your quiet courage and your refusal to bend before adversity that would break weaker people, I feel something I believed had been buried with Catherine. Isabel felt tears finally overflow, sliding warm down her chilled cheeks. You cannot love me. I am no one. Nothing more than a refugee dependent on your charity. You are everything. Benjamin bent down, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling. And the difference between nothing and everything is precisely this that I feel when you are near. Isabel's resistance crumbled like a sand wall before an inevitable tide. Her hands rose, touching his face with a hesitation that gradually transformed into certainty. I am so afraid, she whispered, afraid that this is a dream from which I will awaken to find myself alone again, with nothing but memories of impossible happiness. It is not a dream. He captured her hands, pressing them against his chest where she could feel the strong beat of his heart. Though I cannot promise you everything you deserve, though there are complications I cannot simply ignore, I promise you this: I will not abandon you. I will not allow the world to destroy you for having been brave enough to love a broken man who does not deserve such a gift. You are not broken, Isabel corrected, only wounded. And wounds can heal, given time and proper care. Benjamin leaned closer, and Isabel closed her eyes, anticipating a kiss that would transcend boundaries they had both fought so hard to maintain. But the moment before their lips met, the sound of a door opening echoed through the corridor, followed by Mrs. Walsh's shrill voice calling for Mademoiselle Dubois. They sprang apart with guilty speed. An appropriate distance restored seconds before the governess entered the library. Her sharp gaze moved between them, registering flushed faces, quickened breaths, a charged atmosphere that no amount of composure could entirely disguise. Forgive the interruption, she said with a dryness that did not hide her disapproval. But Margaret is asking for you, mademoiselle. Something about a French lesson she wishes to review. Isabel nodded, not trusting her voice to maintain proper steadiness. As she passed Mrs. Walsh towards the door, the governess touched her arm lightly, a gesture that conveyed a warning more eloquently than words. Alone in the corridor, Isabel pressed a hand against her chest, trying to calm her heart which galloped like an unbridled horse. What had almost happened in the library could not be undone, no matter how many appropriate distances were restored. Benjamin had declared a love that Isabel knew was reciprocated, even if she had not yet uttered the words aloud. And now what would they do with this impossible truth? The days following the storm brought a subtle but fundamental shift in the dynamic of Crawford Mansion. Benjamin no longer actively avoided Isabel. Instead, he sought opportunities for brief private conversations, stolen moments where they could exist simply as man and woman, temporarily stripped of the social roles that made their affection mutually problematic. During a music lesson one afternoon, as the children practiced a duet on Catherine's piano, Benjamin appeared unexpectedly at the room's doorway. His gaze met Isabel's across the space, and something passed between them that made the air feel electrically charged. Continue, he instructed, when Margaret paused, looking uncertainly between her father and the governess. I merely wish to hear your progress. He settled into the armchair that had been Catherine's favorite, a position that allowed him to observe both the children and Isabel without the appearance of impropriety. But Isabel felt the weight of his gaze as a physical presence, her awareness of every movement magnified by the attention he bestowed. When the lesson concluded, and the children were dismissed for independent study, Isabel found herself alone again with Benjamin in the room laden with memories of his late wife. They have improved remarkably, Benjamin observed, but his eyes did not leave her face. Your influence has transformed not only their academic abilities, but their spirits. Margaret smiles now, genuinely. William displays a confidence he never possessed before. They are resilient children, Isabel replied, aware that they should be discussing pedagogy, but both were thinking of entirely different matters. They merely needed permission to be happy again, as did I. Benjamin rose, approaching with a deliberation that made Isabel's pulse quicken. As I needed permission, I didn't know how to grant myself until you arrived with your unwavering courage and your refusal to accept that mere survival was enough. He stopped a few feet from her, a proximity that violated convention, but which both seemed unable to resist. "Isabel, I need you to understand something. I cannot offer you public courtship. I cannot openly declare feelings that would threaten your position in this house. New York society is cruel to women in your situation, and I will not expose you to a scandal that could utterly destroy you." "Then what can you offer?" The question emerged without accusation, merely an honest need to understand the parameters of this impossible connection. Benjamin hesitated, and Isabel saw a struggle waging behind his eyes. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a fundamental decision. Marriage. The world seemed to stop. Isabel stared at him, uncertain if she had heard correctly, if that single word meant what she thought it meant. "Marriage," she repeated, testing the word as if it were a foreign language. "Benjamin, you cannot be serious. The differences between our stations, my lack of fortune, the fact that I am your employee, all irrelevant." He captured her hands, holding them with an urgency that communicated absolute certainty. "I am a wealthy widower whose personal choices are his own affair. I can marry whom I wish without consulting society or its opinions. And I wish to marry you, Isabelle Dubois. Not because you are convenient or appropriate, but because I cannot imagine a future where you are not by my side." Tears stung her eyes again, but this time they were of joy mingled with fear. "And what if you regret it? When the novelty fades, and you realize you have bound your name to a woman with nothing to offer but an education and a heart that has already been too broken. Then I shall be the most foolish man who ever lived." Benjamin pulled her closer, enveloping her in an embrace that communicated a security Isabel hadn't felt since before her father's death. "But I will not regret it. Of this, I am as certain as of anything in my life." Isabel allowed herself to sink into his warmth, into the arms that seemed to offer the refuge she had desperately sought since arriving in America. But even amidst the joy, a seed of doubt persisted. "The children," she murmured against his chest, "how will they react?" "With happiness, I believe." Benjamin pressed a kiss against the top of her head, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. "They love you, Isabel. Perhaps they understood before we ourselves did what we were so determined to deny." They remained thus for a time that could have been seconds or an eternity, two survivors of separate shipwrecks finding harbor in each other. When they finally parted, Isabel saw a future stretching before her that moments before had seemed impossible. But happiness still carried a shadow of uncertainty, an awareness that decisions made in moments of intense emotion often revealed unexpected complications when confronted by the cold light of reality. Benjamin Crawford's decision to propose marriage to Isabelle Dubois should have been a moment of unequivocal joy, but both quickly discovered that declarations made in the privacy of warm libraries faced considerable resistance when confronted with the social realities of New York in 1847. The first resistance came, surprisingly, not from external society, but from within the mansion itself. Mrs. Walsh, whose loyalty to the Crawford family was unquestionable, requested a private audience with Benjamin 3 days after the proposal, when rumors began to circulate among the servants. Isabel was aware of the meeting only because Margaret had casually mentioned that the governess seemed particularly tense that morning. When Benjamin emerged from his study an hour later, his somber expression revealed that the conversation had not been pleasant. He found Isabel in the winter garden, where she was overseeing the children's botanical studies. A single glance was enough to communicate the need for a private conversation. She dismissed Margaret and William with instructions to copy descriptions of specific plants, then followed Benjamin into an adjacent corridor. "Mrs. Walsh expressed concerns," he said without preamble, keeping his voice low but laden with frustration. "She believes that a marriage between us would be a mistake that would harm both my reputation and the well-being of the children." Isabel felt something cold settle in her stomach. "And do you agree with her?" "No." The answer came firm, but Benjamin ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of exasperation. "However, her arguments are not entirely without merit. She correctly observes that New York society can be cruel, that the difference in our stations will fuel malicious speculation, that Margaret and William may suffer social consequences from having a stepmother who was a governess. Then perhaps she is right. Isabel forced the words through the constriction in her throat. Perhaps my presence in this house was a mistake from the beginning. I can seek a position elsewhere, free you from a complication that has clearly become problematic. Absolutely not. Benjamin captured her hands, the urgency in his touch contradicting the formality of the corridor where any servant could observe them. I will not allow you to flee because other people cannot comprehend what we share. Mrs. Walsh is loyal and well-intentioned, but her concerns reflect social conventions that I choose not to honor blindly. But the children. Isabel lowered her voice even further. If my presence as your wife causes them social harm, how can I live with such knowledge? Benjamin remained silent for a moment, clearly grappling with a genuine dilemma. Then we must approach them directly, include them in a decision that will profoundly affect their lives. The suggestion was unconventional, possibly imprudent, but it carried a logic that Isabel could not deny. Children deserved a voice in matters that would reshape a family structure already fragile from previous loss. That evening, after a dinner that passed with tension perceptible only to the adults, Benjamin gathered Margaret and William in the study. Isabel was present, positioned slightly apart, an observer of a scene whose outcome would determine the trajectory of her future. I need to discuss an important matter with you, Benjamin began, sitting down so he was at the children's eye level, something that will change our family, should you both agree. Margaret, ever perceptive, studied her father's face with an expression that seemed too mature for her 9 years. Does it concern Mademoiselle Dubois? Benjamin showed no surprise at his daughter's perception. Yes, I wish to marry her, to make her a permanent part of our family. But such a decision will affect both of you deeply, and I will not take this step without your consent. William looked between his father and Isabel, childish confusion mingling with something that could be hope. Would she be our new mother? The question hung in the air, laden with complex meanings. Isabel felt tears threaten, but she held them back, knowing this moment belonged to the children, not to her own emotions. She would not replace your mother, Benjamin answered carefully. Catherine will always be your mother, the one who gave you life and love. But Mademoiselle Dubois could offer you care, guidance, affection that a family needs to prosper. Margaret rose, approaching Isabel with a deliberation that made her heart quicken. Do you love us? She asked directly, her dark eyes seeking unvarnished truth. Isabel knelt, bringing herself to the girl's level. I love you deeply. Both of you have become precious to me in ways that transcend professional obligation. But I understand that accepting me as part of your family is a complex decision, and I will not blame you if you deem it impossible. But would you leave us? William's voice carried a fear that cut Isabel deeply. If we don't agree, will you depart like the other governesses? I do not wish to leave, Isabel admitted honestly. But neither will I remain if my presence causes you pain or conflict. Your well-being is more important than my personal happiness. Margaret extended a small hand, touching Isabel's face with unexpected tenderness. You taught us that courage means choosing life, even when pain tried to teach us to choose death. It would be cowardly of us to refuse happiness because we are afraid to lose again. The maturity of the observation stunned Isabel. She embraced Margaret, finally allowing tears to flow. William joined the embrace moments later, small arms wrapping around both of them with surprising strength. When they finally separated, Benjamin observed with an expression that blended relief, love, and something that could be admiration for his children, who displayed wisdom beyond their years. So are we agreed, Minnie asked. Will Mademoiselle Dubois officially join our family? Yes, Margaret replied firmly, but under one condition. Benjamin raised an eyebrow, genuine curiosity replacing tension. What condition? That you do not try to protect us from everything, that you allow us to feel, even when feelings are difficult. Margaret looked at Isabel, then at her father. Mother would not wish for us to live like ghosts. She would wish for us to love again, even knowing that love always brings the risk of loss. The truth contained in the child's words silenced all the adults. Benjamin approached, embracing both children with Isabel still kneeling between them, creating a circle of connection that symbolized a family being rebuilt on foundations of honest loss and courageous hope. But family consensus, though crucial, was only the first hurdle. New York society proved significantly less understanding than 9- and 6-year-old children. The announcement of the engagement, made discreetly through a note in a respectable newspaper, generated an immediate reaction. Social invitations that had previously arrived regularly at the Crawford mansion ceased abruptly. Benjamin's business acquaintances showed polite but noticeable discomfort. Mothers of Margaret's potential suitors, anticipating a distant future, but already planning strategic alliances, subtly withdrew their daughters from circles where they might interact with the Crawford family. The most evident cruelty came through an anonymous letter, delivered on a grey March afternoon. Mrs. Walsh brought it to Benjamin with an expression that mixed anger and concern. He read it in the privacy of his study, then summoned Isabel. "Someone with considerable time and substantial malice has compiled a detailed history of your family," he said, offering her the document. "Your father's bankruptcies, the circumstances of your arrival in America, even rumors about creditors who would still be seeking you in France." Isabel read with trembling hands, each word a stab into wounds she had believed partially healed. "It is all true," she murmured finally. "My father was financially imprudent. Our debts were substantial. I fled to avoid imprisonment for obligations I could never settle." "And none of that alters my feelings," Benjamin declared firmly. "But I must warn you that life as my wife may be more difficult than we anticipated. Society can be unforgiving towards those who defy its conventions." Isabel faced a decision she recognized as definitive. She could retreat, protect Benjamin and the children from associative scandal, preserve dignity through noble renunciation. Or she could choose the courage she had preached to the children, accept the love offered despite the social consequences. "My father taught me many things before he lost himself in his own weakness," she said finally. "One of them was that true dignity comes not from external approval, but from personal integrity. If our union is based on genuine love and mutual respect, then the opinions of a society that values birth over character are irrelevant." Benjamin smiled, the first expression of genuine joy she had seen in days. "Then you will stay, even knowing that marrying me will subject you to cruel scrutiny and potential social exclusion?" "I will stay," Isabel confirmed, "because I have learned that a life lived in conformity with others' expectations is not a true life, and because I love you too much to allow fear to dictate my choices." The wedding took place on a clear April morning, a small ceremony in the private chapel that was rarely used. Only the immediate family and Mrs. Walsh, whose initial disapproval had transformed into reluctant acceptance, were present. Margaret served as bridesmaid, wearing a blue velvet dress that had belonged to Catherine, carefully altered by the seamstress. William held the rings with a seriousness that made Isabel smile through tears. When Benjamin slid a simple gold ring onto her finger, Isabel felt the weight of a commitment that transcended metal and ceremony. They were choosing to build a future upon the ruins of past losses, refusing to allow tragedy to completely define their trajectories. The kiss that sealed their union was chaste, appropriate for the children's presence, but it carried the promise of a deeper intimacy, awaiting future privacy. In the months that followed, Isabel Crawford, as she was now known, discovered that predictions of social difficulties were not exaggerated. Doors that might once have opened remained closed. Invitations to important events did not arrive. Margaret reported, with a pragmatism that broke Isabel's heart, that some schoolmates had been forbidden from playing with her by their disapproving mothers. But there were also unexpected discoveries. A small circle of acquaintances, including an eccentric widow who had defied conventions of her own, and an immigrant merchant who understood prejudices against foreigners, offered genuine friendship. The children, far from being permanently harmed, displayed remarkable resilience, learning valuable lessons about judging people by character instead of social standing. And Benjamin, finally freed from the paralyzing grief that had imprisoned him for years, flourished in ways that Mrs. Walsh admitted, in a rare moment of frankness, were miraculous. He laughed again, played with his children, allowed himself to experience joy without debilitating guilt. One summer afternoon, as Isabel was in the garden, she had transformed from neglected abandonment into a cultivated space of beauty. Benjamin joined her. They sat on the bench under a flowering tree, watching Margaret and William chase butterflies with a childlike enthusiasm that months before would have seemed impossible. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked, taking her hand. Isabel considered the question honestly. Her life as Mrs. Crawford was not the socially triumphant existence that young French aristocrats dreamed of, but it was a life filled with love, purpose, genuine connections that transcended the superficiality of social approval. "None," she replied finally. "I lost fortune, country, my original family, but I found something more precious than all of that. I found a home not defined by walls or position, but by people who choose to love each other despite all the logical reasons not to." Benjamin pulled her closer, and Isabel leaned back against him, allowing herself a moment of pure contentment. The future still held uncertainties, challenges they could not fully foresee. But they would face them together, a family rebuilt on a foundation of honesty, courage, and love that refused to bend before conventions that valued appearance over substance. The children ran towards them, Margaret holding a butterfly carefully in cupped hands, William chattering animatedly about a discovery he had made. Isabel looked at Benjamin, saw the reflection of her own happiness in his eyes, and knew with absolute certainty that all the losses, all the pain, all the struggles had been necessary paths that led her precisely to this moment, this family, this love that had proven stronger than convention, more enduring than social approval, truer than any fairy tale she had imagined in her privileged but ultimately empty youth. This was true redemption. Not the elimination of scars, but their transformation into maps that told stories of survival, resilience, and the courage to choose life even when death would seem simpler. And Isabel Dubois Crawford, refugee turned wife, governess turned mother, finally understood that home was not a place from which she came, but a destination she chose to build with those brave enough to love her completely.